So every year Android fans kind of go through the same thing. At some point a Nexus leak will happen and then people start freaking out and they start blowing everything out of proportion. Then we get really overhyped and then it actually releases and we're really disappointed. But this year that trend kind of stopped. This is the Huawei made Nexus 6P, and it's the first time that I can really say this is a Nexus for about anybody. There's always been a critical but with Nexus phones. But the camera's terrible, but the battery's terrible, but the camera and battery are terrible. But this year, there really isn't much to complain about. So you could argue that the Nexus 6 from last year was the first quote-unquote premium Nexus, but then once you compare it to the 6P, it's not even a close competition. The 6P comes with an all-aluminum build with some really nice chamfered edges and just the attention to detail that wasn't there on the original 6. It's not to say the Nexus 6 was poorly built, it's just that this one feels like an Italian race car, and the Nexus 6 kind of feels like a Ford Focus in comparison. Sure, they both do the same thing in principle, but one of them does it with a lot more finesse. So if you turn around to the back of the phone, you're gonna notice it's kind of different than what we're used to seeing. There's a big black bar on the top, and we so lovingly call that the visor, and all it does is house the camera, the flash, and the laser autofocus. It's got some few other sensors to the right of it too. This is interesting. It's definitely different, but I think it's a really nice way to make this phone look unique while still being kind of classy. I don't know, it's got a weird allure to it. So below that is a little mic, and then below the mic is a Nexus Imprint fingerprint scanner, which reads really well. And now that fingerprint recognition is part of the Android system, in 6.0 there's a new included fingerprint API, we should expect to see a lot more fingerprint scanners on phones in the coming year. In the center in big bold lettering is a Nexus symbol emblazoned in silkscreen, and then on the bottom there's a little Huawei one. And it's interesting because this is the first real major Huawei phone to hit the States, and they've been trying to make their way over here, so I'm curious to see what happens with them in the coming year. Button placement's pretty standard. On the right hand side you've got a nice textured power button that clicks real well, and then on the bottom there's a little volume rocker too. These are actually made out of aluminum also, so it just kind of matches the overall theme of the phone. And you probably noticed there are stripes around the entire trim of the phone. And if you paid attention, this is on pretty much every phone with aluminum in it right now. And these are actually bands to help the antennas get reception because radio waves don't transfer very well through metal. On the left hand side is your SIM card tray, and then that's about it. And on the bottom is really neat. It's the new USB-C standard. I can go on about the new features of USB-C, but for being real here, all you really care about is that it's reversible and it charges faster, both of which are very welcome improvements. So let's talk specs real quick. On the front, you're looking at a 5.7-inch Super AMOLED Quad HD display. This means it's got a resolution of 1440 by 2560. It's also worth mentioning that the folks who worked on this phone at Google said that this is the latest generation AMOLED panel from Samsung. And in case you didn't know, Samsung has been killing it with their screens this year, so this is entirely a good thing. You've also got dual front-facing stereo speakers on the front, which sounds great, but I've got to admit, they're not quite as loud as the ones on the original Nexus 6. There's also an 8-megapixel front-facing camera on the top left, and we'll touch on that later. Internally, you're looking at a revised Snapdragon 810 processor. Let me just throw this out of the way right now. This thing in no circumstances heated up. At least it didn't heat up any more than a phone normally would. So at some point this was worked out. It's got an Adreno 430 GPU, 3GB of RAM, and either 32, 64, and for the first time ever, 128GB of storage, depending on how much you want to pay. It's also got a battery with a 3,450 mAh capacity, so that's pretty nice. Overall, it's kind of the total package. It's really what we've been asking for out of a Nexus phone for quite a while. I don't have too much to complain on in the specs department. I do wish that it had a micro SD card slot, but that's never been a thing on a Nexus phone, and I really doubt it's ever going to be. Also, the battery is not user replaceable. For me, that's not a problem, but I know for some people that's kind of a big deal. So within that visor is a 12.3 megapixel sensor from Sony with pretty large 1.55 micron pixels. What that last part means is that the actual pixels themselves are larger, so the camera is capable of taking in much more light. And trust me, it shows. There's also a dual tone flash and a laser autofocus to the right of the camera. It's both really weird and really nice to say that a Nexus phone has not only a good camera, but a great camera. Like pretty much any smartphone, it'll take great pictures in good conditions. Unlike pretty much every smartphone, it also takes really solid pictures in low light. Having OIS here would probably make the camera even better in low light, but even without it, the 6P is able to pull off some pretty impressive night shots. Like this picture of some Coney Island beer, which for the record is much better than Not Your Father's Root Beer. I remember taking this picture and being kind of surprised because the picture itself actually has more light than my eyes were able to perceive at the moment. Also, I'm only going to assume that it's the laser autofocus doing its job, but the camera focuses really quickly and most of the time exactly where I want it. As far as the actual picture quality goes, the pictures tend to be a little oversaturated, but I'd much rather have punchier colors than dull colors. As a whole, they look really sharp, really clear, and most importantly, are super quick to take. All you've got to do is double tap the power button and it goes straight into the viewfinder. You can easily double tap that power button and take a picture in under 2 seconds. The video quality is about in line with pictures. Colors can be a little oversaturated, but having that laser autofocus counterbalances that for me because it actually helps keep your subjects clear. And that's something that the original Nexus 6 struggled with a lot. Having OIS would have been really nice here because it would make videos smoother, but the electronic stabilization does enough to make videos plenty watchable. You can also record slow-mo in 720p at either 120 or 240 frames per second, which looks so damn cool. You can record 4K too, but pretty much most phones can do that anymore. My biggest complaint with the camera really is the viewfinder. It's really pretty and quick, but it's almost painfully simple. I mean, this wouldn't be a bad thing if there were more granular settings that you can enable, but nope, nothing to be found. At the end of the day, it's really hard to complain about the camera on the 6P, and if I do, it's nitpicking. Google finally delivered with a good camera on a Nexus, and I think I speak for everybody when I say it's about time. Performance is something that's kind of tricky to talk about because it really varies on everybody's usage. A good benchmark, I think, though, is think about how every year we get a new iPhone and a new version of iOS. With this new software, it typically runs well about 99% of the time, and that extra 1% is reserved for just unpredictable split-second stutter. Well, that's the 6P. Performance is fantastic and consistent 99% of the time, with that 1% of the time where you'll have a random jank, but nothing that takes away from the experience. Marshmallow this year did a really good job smoothing out everything and crushing bugs, so I really don't have anything to complain about, and I'm probably one of the hardest users you'll find on a phone. Let's take a second to talk about Marshmallow real quick. There's not really a whole lot to say. It's basically a performance update from Lollipop. It also has a new feature called Doze, which in a nutshell puts your apps to sleep when you're not using them and your phone's just kind of chilling there, meaning standby time is insane now. There really isn't much to say because the end user doesn't see too much in Marshmallow. You've got Google Now on tap, which gives you contextual information on your screen, but I find that it only works about half the time, and sometimes it ends up giving you different results for the exact same thing. We'll see how it ages. It's a really cool concept, but right now it's just not ready. Kind of feels half-baked. To kind of wrap things up here, there really isn't a whole lot to complain about on the 6P that's not nitpicking. Sure, it'd be nice if you could have micro SD card expansion, and it'd be really nice if you could replace the battery, but those aren't deal breakers for me. This is the first phone in a long time that I can recommend to just about anybody, and it happens to be a Nexus. It's got a great camera, a great build, good battery life, and a fantastic user experience. It also comes with the promise of timely software updates and quick security patches. At the end of the day, as a consumer, you can't ask for too much more. That's all. I hope you liked this video. Make sure if you got any questions, leave them down below and either myself or somebody else will get to them for you. And if you enjoy what I do, please do subscribe and leave a thumbs up. It really does help me. And that's all I've got. I'll see you in the next video.